Let's go now to our Parliament House studio in Canberra. We're joined by the opposition immigration spokesman, Scott Morrison. Thanks for being there.
Thank you, Tony.
Now, does the Coalition have anything new to contribute to this expert panel, which is being set up to report on asylum seeker policy?
Well, if you're referring to the multi-party committee that the Prime Minister referred to earlier tonight, we'll wait to see what the details of that are. I'm sure there'll be an invitation with the terms of reference, and we'll look at that carefully when it's provided to us. And so that's what we plan to do there, Tony. I mean, what we obviously can contribute, though, Tony, is that all along this process, Senator Evans said it himself today in the Senate when he outlined his own decisions as Immigration Minister to abolish the measures that worked. And frankly, that's why Senator Evans was speaking in the Senate again today. If that had never happened,
we'll have a bit of time to talk about these
Sure.
issues. First of all, do you trust Angus Houston?
Oh, Angus Houston is a distinguished Australian, as is Paris Aristotle. I know Paris very, very well. But what we've got here, what we need today is we need to do more than set up panels and committees. We can't just be going and contracting out the government's responsibility to govern and just setting up other committees. I mean, the Prime Minister tomorrow can restore temporary protection visas. She can give different instructions to the Navy. She can deal with the serious integrity issues with the assessment process that the whole Captain Emad saga exposed. And she can, as Tony Abbott said today, get cracking on getting the processing centre on Nauru ready for opening.
Okay,
now, she can do all of those
let's
things
just get
tomorrow.
back to this expert panel because they're being set up to advise on asylum seeker policy. If they come up with what they regard as a decent, workable solution, are you prepared to listen to them?
Well, I've always been prepared to listen to Paris Aristotle and to Angus Houston. I think they're distinguished Australians, and of course I'd be prepared to listen to them and many others. But one thing the government needs to listen to is the evidence of the last 4 years, and which they remain in denial. And I noticed that with Minister Bowen earlier tonight, and I noticed it with the government speakers in the House and the Senate this last couple of days. I mean, they remain in complete denial about why we're in this position in the first place, and I don't think the Australian people are in denial about that. They know very well how we got here. It has been, sadly, a failure of government policy, not the Parliament's policy, and we're in this jam now because of the decisions that this government has taken. Now, we worked very hard, Tony, and maybe that's what we'd like to talk about, how we might have broke that deadlock.
Let's talk about some of your issues. I mean, is turning back the boat still a core element of your policy?
Yes.
So, well, to take Joe Hockey's argument, for example, will you be checking those boats to make sure there are no unaccompanied children on board before you send them back to Indonesia, a country which is not a signatory to the human rights, to the Refugee Convention?
Well, every single boat, Tony, that leaves Indonesia is a boat that we would not like to see leave Indonesia. And so the measures that are put in place to stop boats leaving Indonesia that this government is implementing as we speak means that people remain in Indonesia. Now, turning boats back is very similar to that arrangement. But we've always said, Tony, that we will do it where it is safe to do so. And so that is our policy, and it always has been.
It's a simple question, though, because your main objection to the Malaysian solution is that the Malaysians are not signatories to the Refugee Convention. Neither are the Indonesians, yet you would propose sending perhaps children on boats back to Indonesia.
Well, these policies I don't think are comparable, Tony, for this reason. If someone crosses our sea border, they come under our obligations and they come under our law. And what the government has sought to do is abolish human rights protections in our law for offshore processing. Turning boats back is not offshore processing. I've never suggested it is. And it remains a core part of our policy because when we did it, we cut the boats coming to Australia, and it was a key part of a successful suite of measures because we've always said, Tony, as you know, because you followed this debate for a very long time,
let's just stick to that measure for a minute, though. Let's just stick to that particular measure for a minute. What you're proposing is essentially an Indonesian solution. The President of Indonesia is coming to Australia on the weekend. Are you proposing to have meetings with Indonesian officials to explain to them this policy? Because so far they've completely rejected this idea.
Well, what the Marty Natalegawa has said is that you need measures that go right across the spectrum. That's what he actually said, particularly when he was here in Australia. And we do have measures that go right across the spectrum.
But have you actually asked him whether or not he would accept Australia turning back boats to Indonesia, as you're proposing as a core element of your policy?
Well, our policies have been explained to the Indonesian government. Julie Bishop was up in the region very recently, and she had a very successful visit and trip. We talked to the Indonesian government where appropriate.
We're going to be hearing this very soon. In a few days, we'll be hearing their response to this, no doubt. So what response have you got from the Indonesians about this core policy of turning back boats to Indonesia?
Well, as I said, the response mirrors what Mr Nalagawa said when he was in Australia, and they want to see measures that go across a spectrum. Now, that is exactly the point. We have always said you need a suite of measures. We've never said Nauru on its own work. We've never said temporary protection visas on its own work.
I'm just going to stick with this one point for a moment. What have they said to you about the idea of using the Australian Navy to turn back asylum seeker vessels to Indonesia?
Well, I've already answered the question, Tony. They've said you need a spectrum of measures, and we will have a spectrum of measures. We will have a very close relationship with Indonesia in working with them to deal with this problem. I have always agreed you need a regional response to this problem as well as a domestic response and an international response. So, Tony, you asked me whether it remains our policy. Yes, it does.
And if they say no, will you continue with that policy regardless?
We will be able to implement the policy in the same manner as we did when we were last in government.
Finally, can you tell me what the moral distinction is between sending people back to Malaysia as a deterrent, a country which is not a signatory of the Refugee Convention, and sending them back to Indonesia as a deterrent, a country which is not a signatory of the Refugee Convention?
Well, as I said, I equate turning boats back with the same as stopping boats from leaving Indonesia, because people we stop from leaving Indonesia remain in Indonesia. But, Tony, over the course of these last couple of days, we have worked very, very hard to try and break the deadlock that has occurred in this parliament. We have moved significant ground, made commitments on extra funding for processing centres in Indonesia and in Malaysia. We made that today, and that was rejected. We made the offer to increase the refugee intake, and that was rejected. We've worked hard to make the common ground, and the Prime Minister has opted today for 100% of nothing rather than 50% of something. And I think the Australian people would have liked their Prime Minister today to opt for that 50% of something, which would have meant we would have had a bill agreed to tonight. Now, I'm very regretful that we did not get a bill tonight, but the Prime Minister tomorrow can act on all of the measures that we've always argued that she should. Temporary protection visas, new instructions to the Navy, and opening that processing centre at Nauru as soon as she can. That's what she can do tomorrow. She can have her committees and her panels, but I think we needed her act tomorrow.
And a very brief final answer. What do you think of the Greens solution, which is to simply take thousands of those people who are in Indonesia before they get on boats and bring them as part of the refugee intake to Australia?
Well, I don't think it stops the boats, but I've always agreed that increasing our intake out of Asia has been a very positive part of running our program, and I've never had any objections to that. As you know, I've been in Malaysia and I've met the many asylum seekers and refugees who live in Malaysia, and frankly, Tony, that is one of the reasons why I have such strong objections to what the government is proposing to do. Which was to strip those human rights protections. This week we've stuck true to our principles, Tony. We've always believed in offshore processing and we've always believed in offshore protections. We believe the two should go together, and that's what we've argued for this week, and that's what's been rejected by the government, and I'm sad that they've taken that decision.
Can you cite anywhere in the UN Refugee Convention which says it's okay to stop boats and turn them back?
Well, can you cite where it is not, Tony?
No.
I mean, these things are in international waters, and we have the legal right to turn and seize a boat, which we believe is going to violate Australia's immigration laws. We have that right under international law, and that's firmly established. So we are well in our rights, and if that were not the case, Tony, then we would have naval commanders who were involved in that policy last time who would have been brought up on international charges. Now, that never happened because we implemented that policy consistent with our obligations and consistent with our suite of measures, which had the desired result, which we would like to see restored, because in the last 4 years we've had almost 20,000 people turn up, and the tragedies that we've seen haven't just been happening recently, Tony. They've been happening for years, and it's taken a long time for this government to notice.
OK, we're out of time. Thank you very much, Scott Morrison.
Thanks very much, Tony.